Welcome back to Sahara TV. My name is Rudolph Okonkwo. A prominent subject in this campaign is the issue of Boko Haram. They are cited as one of the reasons why the 2015 elections were postponed. No journalist has been able to bring home the stories of the victims of Boko Haram insurgents from the time they kidnapped Chibok schoolgirls better than our next guest. Chika Oduah is a freelance journalist based in Nigeria. Her works have appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Al Jazeera, and many other international media. Ms. Oduah, welcome to Sahara TV.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here.
So I know you're based in Abuja, but you recently returned from the Northeast. What is the current situation in the Northeast?
The current situation right now is that people in Jos, people in Yobe, people in Biu, those three are just a few of the localities where people are still suffering from bomb attacks, and just this week alone. I should also mention people in Kano as well. There was an attack at a bus station there this week. So attacks are still happening daily. Sometimes you go through life in Nigeria and there's not one day you don't hear of an attack. But I would say that from what we're hearing on the government's end is that there does seem to be an aggressive military offense in conjunction with all of the countries surrounding Lake Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria, of course. All the countries are trying to put forces together to scorch out the terrorists. Whether or not that's happening or not, it's hard to know because residents are not even able to give word. For example, in Baga, we don't know exactly what's happening there. When the president went there, journalists were not allowed to go. Same thing with the Army Chief of Staff. So I think in some areas we're hearing clear word that the Army is doing something. For example, in Mubi, residents have come back to say, yes, Mubi has been largely freed of terrorists, but in places like Baga, it's still very murky. So I would say right now there does seem to be an offensive going on, but attacks are happening daily, sometimes twice a day across northeastern Nigeria.
What about your contacts down there? Are they giving you the impression that things are changing or that things are the same?
Depends on who you talk to. Sometimes I'm talking to civilian JTF people, and they do seem to be very enthusiastic. They do seem to have a sense of increased morale as far as the civilian JTF, that things are getting better because they've been, the military has been equipped recently. New equipment has come in. Also, some of the commanders on ground have been changed. So when you talk to those people, they say, yes, something is changing. But when you talk to residents, they're still saying that this is just more of the same that they've been experiencing for the past, well, ongoing now 6 years.
Do you think that the election plan for March 28th will happen?
I wouldn't be surprised if it does not. We've already heard the INEC chairman say that he cannot guarantee that the elections will take place on March 28th. A lot of my contacts in the north say that they don't think it's going to happen. We already know that Abubakar Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, has released statements saying that he'll make sure that there will be unrest just before the election so that they may not take place. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if they were postponed again.
Okay, you recently chronicled the plight of children of Boko Haram orphans for Al Jazeera. What led you to that story, and what were the surprises you encountered while you were doing this story?
I was, if I can answer your first question second, let me start with the surprises. I was surprised on ground whenever I go to the Northeast, whether that's Maiduguri or even Gulag, when I went to Gulag. There are so few journalists there, local and international journalists. I expected to see more journalists, especially in places like Yola. I think Yola is relatively safe for journalists to go, Western journalists, but I don't see many. So I think that's very discouraging, a bit disappointing, because I'd like to see more journalists on ground getting those stories as opposed to reporting from Lagos. And then the first question you asked, what led me to do the story? I'm very much interested in people, how people are being affected. It's not always the analysts that need to be heard. We hear so much analysts in Washington, D.C., giving us their viewpoints, but we don't hear enough about what the people are saying. So I try to let the people talk as much as they can.
Now, one important project that you also did last year, I believe, was the Global Post project on lead poisoning in northern Nigeria. I will pause so that our viewers can see a little bit of the multimedia you produced as a result of that project, and then we discuss it.
Abin da aka ga tana yi wannan yarinya da an kaga shi ya kama da haka nan sai man ka wuce da shi can asibitin Gubar Dalma. Man tahe da shi yana ta gudane cikin asibiti kamar lahiya ta wale an kaga shi kawai yana da lahiya. To zuwa cikin dare sai dai matsalar ta same shi sai tashi ya liƙa da gudu sai da aka rikike shi. Ko da an ka rikike shi an ka ce masa galu kuma nan ya liƙa da gudu aka bani shi suka ce an goye. Da na goye shi sai idanu ne suka lullube jib sai ya kama fizge-fizge to da wa'annan idan nashi suka rihi sai da yayi kwana 4 ba a ga ƙwayar ijiya ta ba ana ta bashi magungunan da suka iya suna ta yi da ƙare-ƙaren ruwa sai da ya samu sati 2 idan na lullube jib ba ya ganin kowa kana suna nan bai da maganin suna nan kuma yana fizge-fizgen bai fasa ba duk ya kama fizge-fizgen su ta su yi mai allure su ba shi magani sai fizge-fizgen ya kwanta aka ci gaba da yi har kwanan wata guda kana an ka samu idanun nashi son ka buɗe ko da son kai ta aune-aunen da suka yi aka ce ba ya gani ya makanci aka sallamu mun kayo gida
kai ikallo ta lula kuma ikallo ai ma ko ke waki daga nan
bai kamata bayanin idanka.
You reported on that story. How did you, what made you go for that story about lead poisoning?
It was such a huge story, first of all. This was in the New York Times. This was reported in Al Jazeera severally. Correspondents were going there, BBC. But what was not reported that I felt needed to be told was a success that came afterwards. Yes, there was a lead poison outbreak in Zamfara and in other localities, specifically in the northwest of Nigeria, but we don't know actually what happened. And I think that's not fair for journalists to come and only tell one side of the story. I think as journalists, we should try to continue to follow up, keep going back and seeing what happens next, what did happen next. So that's what I wanted to do, to kind of follow up on this story that went huge. And so I wanted to follow up on a guy who helped to stir a campaign to make sure that funding, $5.4 million, did actually get down to the community that had the most lead poison contamination. Now,
this app that saved 1,000 children, tell us more about the app.
Actually, it helped more around 1,500, but I just went for 1,000. But the app, basically, it's a web-based app, and it's an open source app that allows people to track actually what's being spent. So this was actually a pilot. The group that actually had this project, this Bagega, Save Bagega project was their pilot. So they tracked everything. You can go on the website and kind of play around with all the tracking devices and the tools. And of course, that app was promoted via social media, basically Facebook and Twitter. So when we're talking about the app, we're really talking about a web-based application where people could go online and interact with the information that was presented as far as the government's allocation of $5.4 million to help Bagega.
Now, that lead poisoning story had a positive end, but the same cannot be said about other stories out of Africa. Why are African stories often left unresolved?
I think because there's no sense of accountability still. I think that there's the psyche of people on the ground have to change. I think there's a lethargy, if I can use the word, a social lethargy that is present in many African societies as far as politically and government-wise. People allow, or societies allow, problems to fester, social ills to fester, and oftentimes answers don't get positioned unless they hear or they get force from the West, unless they're pressured by the West. But that's my reasoning. I think that there's not enough accountability. There are not enough watchdogs watching African societies and places of politics.
Now, in a recent interview, SaharaTV interview with the spokesman for the military, General Chris Olukolade, he accused the international media of coming to Africa with preconceived notion of things. I know that you've written for several international media and you've dealt with editors. Is that accusation true?
Yes, it is largely true, but then oftentimes it's fulfilled. Someone like the general that you just mentioned, this is a man, you text him, he doesn't respond to text. So what are journalists supposed to do if they don't get information from the people who are supposed to supply the information? So therefore, you're allowing the Western journalists to fulfill their preconceived notions. But he is correct in many aspects. There are a lot of journalists who come to Nigeria from different Western countries, and they already know what they want to write. All they're doing is just filling in the blanks. They want to write about, for example, vaginal fistulas. Girls in Nigeria are dying of childbirth. They already have the story in their head, and they just fill in the blanks. But if someone like the General Olukolade really wants to change that, he needs to actually give information to journalists who are looking for the information. And oftentimes, they don't do that.
Now, is there any difference?
He's also to blame for that.
Now, is there any difference between you, who has African heritage, and those who come from the West, like an American born here who comes to cover Africa? Do you see the African story differently from the way they see African stories?
Well, I try to tell the stories with dignity, and for me, dignity is very, very important. For example, do you want to focus on poverty, or do you want to focus on the man who is struggling to make a living? I think it's about the focus and who exactly are you dignifying. And so I really try to tell stories with dignity. And I get frustrated sometimes when I see Western journalists come here. And I'm also a Western journalist. I sometimes see myself as that. But I see a lot of journalists coming from the West here, and they focus on stereotypes. They tell the story. They're in and out. It's just helicopter, fly in, fly out journalism. They don't ever engage with the people. They don't care to engage with the people. They really don't know. It's just about the story. And for me, when I'm trying to do my reports, I try definitely to make it more than just a story. It's about the person's life. So oftentimes when I do my reporting, I stay in contact with the people that I've been interviewing. When I first came to Nigeria, December 2012, the people I interviewed then, I'm still talking to them now, just to say, hi, how are you doing? So I think for me, it's about building relationships, because ultimately I see myself as an anthropologist. My reporting is kind of anthropological, so I like to see deeper issues and explore those issues. So for me, it's about reporting, number one, with dignity and making it larger than the story. These are people's lives. These people are letting you enter their lives. They should be treated with respect and appreciation, and it's not just a story.
Now, moments ago, you talked about not having local journalists cover the kind of stories you cover. But also, we know that the stories you cover, they appear on the international forum, like international media. They publish it. But local media, they don't publish it. How do you reconcile the idea that you tell these important stories, but it ended up being for foreigners to read, not the local people who you are telling their stories?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, because I think about this often. I would like more Nigerians to read the stories, but the fact is, trying to get these stories published in Nigerian media, sometimes they want to change things around. I've received requests, oh, we like your story, can we publish it, but we want to change this, change that, change this. Oftentimes they don't value the story. They don't think it's worth putting it in their paper. They sometimes say people are not interested in these people type of stories. But it's true, a lot of my stories do go to an international audience. In the future, I would like to see how to change that so that more Nigerians within Nigeria are actually reading the stories as well.
All right, let me ask you one last question. What are the reasons why the Nigerian government is reluctant to allow international journalists to come in and cover the election?
What are the reasons?
Yeah, do you know why, the reason behind the story?
I believe a lot of this started with the Chibok coverage. CNN came, BBC's chief international correspondent, he came. Arise TV flew in. They had a chopper come into Chibok, come out. There was so much coverage around Chibok. And that really put the Nigerian government on edge. And some more information, a lot of people within the government who were allowing journalists to go to the Northeast, they are no longer in those positions. So there was a lot of anxiety during that period. I personally know of at least 12 journalists who are not in Nigeria, they're in France, they're in Switzerland, who are trying to get into Nigeria to cover the elections, and they're not being able to do so. They're being given protocol, long red tape that they have to go through. So this is a deliberate attempt. The Committee to Protect Journalists gave a statement saying that the Nigerian government should allow journalists to come in and cover the elections. I think it's just trying to control the story. You've already mentioned that General Olukolade says that Western journalists, they already have a preconceived notion of the story that they want to tell. They're just coming in to fill in the blanks. I think it's just more of that. Even when I want to interview government people, they'll say things like, oh, are you with Al Jazeera? You already have what you want to cover. You just want to promote more of the bad story. Why do you always tell the bad story? So I think it's an attempt, a very deliberate attempt to control the story.
All right, Chika Oduah, thank you so much for joining us. Viewers, stay tuned because we have more interesting guests coming up.